Mm-mm. Well, let me ask you, before we went to the break, the situation over there in the Middle East, of course, is just getting bigger and bigger, and now Lebanon is starting to react. Do you see this thing, well, obviously I think it is going to be starting to mushroom into something a whole lot bigger, but how long do you figure it'll be before it starts to really affect the markets?
Well, first of all, it's subterfuge. They didn't want to come out and attack Iran and take all of that territory in an outright war, they being the industrial complex in the United States, England, and in Israel. And this is kind of a backdoor way of doing it prior to the Bush administration leaving, because all the companies that are going to make all the money in this thing are connected to these people. And so they wanted to leave with a burgeoning war in progress. And I think Israel and some members of the elitists behind the scenes want a third world war because it's very profitable, and it also will distract from the terrible economic circumstances that beset not only the United States but the entire world, and they're getting daily worse, and they're not getting any better, and they're not going to get any better. And so you have this deflection. If you look at history, it's all there. Every group, dictator, democracy, whatever you've got, whenever they have a problem, they have a war. And so this is nothing unusual. And so that's what I think is going on. How is it going to affect the market? It's going to eventually make it go down, along with all the other problems. I mean, they're talking about 7.2% unemployment. The official figure for U6, which is another formula that they put forward, is 13.5%. But the media never picks it up. Long term is 17.5%.
Yeah.
One of the things I'd like to say here is that I just spent the last 3 hours this morning writing about exactly what Ted was talking about. And for those of you who would like to get a free introductory copy of the Forecaster, that'll be in Wednesday's issue. And there's about 4 or 5, 6 pages on it. And I go over default, devaluation, inflation, hyperinflation. I think what the Fed and the U.S. Treasury are doing and have been doing for the past several months in the theater of lending money, mostly to financial institutions, is going to come home to roost through a monetization process probably in March or April. And that answers your earlier question, is how quickly or when do you think things are going to get, let's say, worse? And that's when they'll begin again. Inflation slid back from about 13 5/8% to about 11% over the past several months as deleveraging took place among hedge funds and others, and that brought down the price of the stocks and the commodities and even gold and silver, although gold lost the very least of all the mediums of investment. But I think we're entering into a time here when, in March and April, when visible signs are going to appear again that inflation is moving back up from 11%. And we still have all the major banks in the world, central banks, creating money at and credit at a rate still of 14%. In fact, right now in England, which is a major country financially, it's 16.2%. And in the Eurozone, it's around 9%. And so they continue to do that, as well as lend money that they don't have, creating out of thin air. Mm-hmm. And I secretly believe that, I believe that the U.S. Treasury is secretly printing Treasury bills, which they are giving to the Fed to use as collateral on loans. And that's immediately monetized, which means it gets into the system. And it also means that it's very quickly inflationary. So following that trail, we're going to see inflation again higher fairly soon, within 3 months, 4 months.
Well, yeah, I think that also when you factor in, we're hearing about all of these different companies that are closing down or cutting jobs, cutting way back. I mean, Alcoa cut, 13,000 positions last week or something like that. We hear the unemployment rate now is, they are sort of dancing around the idea of 10%, but they're not factoring in the people that have fallen off the dole roll. The unemployment benefits, et cetera, and they just can't seem to get back into the workforce because there aren't any jobs. They're losing jobs here. The other thing, I hate to be such a gloom and doomer here, but,
these are only facts. This is the truth.
I understand that.
We're not gloom and doomers. We're just telling people the truth.
Well, I agree with you, but but a lot of folks seem to forget, and we've talked about this before on the program, and a lot of the financial gurus have mentioned this. Jim Rogers has mentioned it, Peter Schiff has mentioned it, many others have mentioned it, that, when comparing the Great Depression of the 1930s, 1929, the crash, et cetera, I mean, compared to what we have today, I mean, at least in those days, we didn't have, they didn't have all these mortgages. They didn't have credit card debt. We were still on a gold standard. People still owned the family farms. People did not have hybrid seeds that they were getting from demonic companies like Monsanto. I mean, the atmosphere, the conditions were so much different then than they are now. We had the infrastructure. We hadn't sold we still had a manufacturing base. We had a way to dig out of the depression. Doesn't seem like we've got those options today. So if we do fall into depression, is there any hope of us digging ourselves out? I'm going to see if I get Bob Chapman's response to that question when we get back from this break.
Well, first of all, there's two important factors you've left out. One is we were on a gold standard, which we're not anymore. And number two,
right.
People owed us money. We didn't owe them money, which is giant today. Now, what is the answer? Immediate imposition of trade tariffs. And that to be followed by a devaluation and a new dollar based upon gold if the U.S. government still has gold left.
I'll pose another question to you, Bob. We were talking about the fact that we had infrastructure, we had family farms that were not under mortgage and all that. You brought up that we were still on the gold standard back in the Great Depression, and I'd like you to continue with that train of thought that you were on, because that's sort of the crux of the problem, isn't it?
It is. When we went off on August the 15th, 1971, we changed the whole structure. The dollar is a reserve unit for the world. And, of course, I mentioned as well as we were a creditor nation during the 30s as opposed to a debtor nation now. And, of course, our debts are 17 trillion plus to foreigners. And so the situation is by a magnitude of 5 or 10 greater than what we were facing in the 1930s. And some $1 trillion or $800 billion stimulus plan is really not the answer. Maybe it's part of the answer, but it's only going to delay the inevitability of collapse. And what they should do is allow the system to slowly deteriorate and purge itself. They shouldn't be bailing out Wall Street and the banks and the insurance companies and General Electric and General Motors. It's insanity.
You're sounding just like Ron Paul, he's been saying, look, we have to let this market correct itself, and we're not going to do it by throwing, by doubling the currency or tripling the currency or just running printing presses 24/7, 365, throwing more gasoline under the fire. So you're basically saying the same thing. We have to let these banks collapse. We have to let these companies go belly up so the market can correct itself. That's what you're saying, right?
Simple, classical economics, as opposed to Keynesianism, and which is what they're doing. And
we've got a lot of listeners out there up in the Detroit area that are not happy when you say that, because, so many jobs and so many businesses are linked to, either directly or indirectly, to the survival of the automotive industry. And if they go down, a lot of folks are going to go down.
The plans were made for the deliberate destruction of the American automobile industry and our manufacturing capabilities in the United States in the early 1960s. The plan went into effect around 1980, and since then you've seen what's happened. And we used to produce 28% of GDP, gross domestic product, in manufactured goods. That's now down to 11%. I don't have to cut you any more pictures you can see what's been done. And this has been done deliberately in a major way by transnational, international conglomerates. And they're all controlled indirectly and directly by the same group of people. And what they do is they build things offshore or create services offshore, ship them into America, and then the profit goes to an offshore corporation, which in turn holds the money tax-free. Now, occasionally the money comes back to the United States, like it did a few years ago when they had a holiday and $360 billion was brought back by these international corporations at 5.25% taxes instead of 33%. It was another gift to the mega rich, if you may. And so that's why they want to do what they're doing.